For a lot of skeptics, the very first question that they have, the very first question on their mind is, does God exist? Are there good reasons to believe? Are there any good reasons to believe that God exists? So in doing apologetics, oftentimes we have to start with that question. Are there good reasons to believe that God exists? And there are a number of arguments that Christian thinkers have made to support the belief in God. And all of these arguments really have two things in common. The first thing that they have in common is that they'll start with truths that can be generally known by people outside of Scripture. So we don't necessarily appeal to Scripture in making these arguments, like Paul in the book of Acts when he's at Lystra and when he's at Athens. He argues for God based on knowledge, common knowledge from the world all around us. And so that's what these arguments for God's existence tend to do. They make arguments from God based on readily observable phenomenon in the world around us. The second thing that they have in common is that they're really not trying to prove that God exists. Any argument that sets out to prove that God exists through human reason alone is really in danger of defending the existence of an idol, not the existence of the God of the universe. We're not trying to prove that God exists. What we're trying to do in these arguments is we're trying to show that the belief in God is indeed reasonable, that based on all of the evidence that we can observe, it's more reasonable to believe that God exists than to believe that God doesn't exist. And so what I want to do in this short video is I want to offer just a handful of the most common arguments that believers have made for the belief that God exists. There are, of course, other arguments that we can talk about, but I'm just going to focus on some of the most common ones. The first one that I want to refer to is often called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument exists in three parts. The first part, or the first premise, says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, what that means is, it's fairly common sense. Whatever comes into being, whatever has a beginning, whatever begins to exist, there's some sort of cause that brought that thing into existence. The second premise says, okay, if this is true, it's also true that the universe began to exist. Ignore my handwriting there. The universe began to exist. So what we're arguing here is that the universe is not infinite, that the universe indeed had a beginning. And there's good reasons, both scientific and philosophical reasons, to believe that the universe is not infinite, that the universe did indeed have a beginning. One of the arguments that I like to make to defend this point is based on the scientific law of thermodynamics, that we know as a law of science that things break down over time. It's a readily observable law of science. It's a law of the universe. So if it's true that things break down over time, then if the universe were infinite, if it were truly infinitely old, then the universe would have broken down at some point infinite number of years ago. And so it's not possible, given the law of thermodynamics, it's not possible that the universe has always existed. There was a time where the universe began to exist. Now, this leads then to the conclusion that the universe has a cause. Now, the skeptic will say, well, you're still a long way away from the God of the Bible. This doesn't necessarily prove anything about the God of the Bible, and that's indeed true, at least to a degree, although the Bible does talk about God bringing the universe into existence from nothing, ex nihilo. This certainly, it's not a description that doesn't fit the God of the Bible. But this, again, these arguments are general arguments trying to establish that it is, in fact, reasonable to believe that God exists. If everything that begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, then it's reasonable to believe that the universe had a cause for its existence. An unimaginably large cause that exists outside of this universe. Something that's in the universe can't cause the universe to exist. And so this points us to the reasonableness of God existing. Now, another very common argument that's made in support of the belief that God exists, I'm just going to call it an argument from design. There's other titles, names that are given to this argument, but I'm just going to call it an argument from design. And there's four issues, there's four problems that confront a skeptic when we look at the universe and when we look specifically at life in the universe and we see what appears to be design. There's four problems that confront the skeptic. The first problem is called specified complexity. Now, let me explain briefly what that means. Specified complexity. Now, if I were to take a bowl full of letters and just dump them onto the ground in any sort of random order, that would be complex. That would be something that's complex. Specified complexity is when you actually take letters in the alphabet and you arrange them in a complex way, sort of like this phrase here, specified complexity. You arrange them in a complex and specified way in order to communicate something. That's specified complexity. And so when you look at the structure of this universe, and specifically the structure of life in this universe, what you see is not just complexity. What you see is actually complexity with a specified intent, with a specified purpose. And so that's one of the arguments that the argument from design makes. The skeptic is also confronted by what's called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity. Now, what irreducible complexity is getting at is the idea that not only do we observe specified complexity in this world and in life, but we also observe complexity that is irreducible. In other words, you can't break it down into any other or any smaller constituent parts. One of the explanations that a skeptic would give for the existence of life in the universe, for instance, is that life just kind of evolved step by step over millions and even billions of years, that life just kind of evolved gradually over time. What irreducible complexity says is it looks at systems, like, for instance, the human cell. It looks at these very small systems and it says these systems are small enough that they are irreducibly complex. In other words, there's no possible way that this thing could have come into being one step at a time. It had to have come into being all at once if it were going to be functional. One of the classic examples of this that's often given is the example of a mousetrap. A mousetrap is irreducibly complex. There's no way for a mousetrap to kind of be put together piece by piece and still be a functioning mousetrap. In order for it to function, it all has to be there or it's not going to be functional at all. And so both specified complexity and irreducible complexity are a problem for the skeptic. Another problem for the skeptic is something that's called fine-tuning. Fine-tuning. Now, what fine-tuning is, here's a way of thinking about fine-tuning. Imagine that you are in a control room. In this control room, we're designed to sustain life on the planet, okay? And in this control room are hundreds of dials and knobs and switches. And all of these dials, all of these knobs and switches, they have to be exactly right. They have to be exactly tuned in a particular way, set in a particular way, if life were actually going to happen. Okay? Now, what fine-tuning observes is this is essentially the situation that we're in. In order for life to exist, frankly, in order for the universe to exist, there are several, even hundreds, of different constants that have to be carefully and meticulously fine-tuned if life were actually going to exist. I want to give you an example of this. We know that there are at least 150 different physical constants needed in order for life to exist. All of these constants must exist with absolute precision. Again, think of that control room with all the knobs and dials and switches. They have to be absolutely precise if life is going to exist. For instance, the ratio, I'm going to give you one of these physical constants. The ratio of electromagnetic force to the gravitational force must be fine-tuned to 1 in 10 to the 40th power. In order for life to exist, it has to be tuned with that level of precision. Caltech astrophysicist Hugh Ross illustrates these odds in this way. Imagine covering every square inch of the surface of North America with dimes. Once that is done, put on another layer. Continue until all the dimes reach the height of the moon, which is 238,000 miles up. Then repeat that 1 billion times. And then pick out one designated dime from that pile of dimes. That's the level of precision that has to exist in order for life to exist in this world. And the person who believes in God simply is saying the chances of this happening are so outrageous that it's more reasonable to believe that this universe were designed by a creator than that this all just happened randomly or accidentally. Here's another problem that faces a skeptic. The problem of common sense. I have a friend who's a skeptic, and he doesn't believe in God. He loves science, though. He loves science. He sent me a picture a while ago. He sent me a picture of a man sitting in a chair with a prosthetic leg. And this prosthetic leg was one of the most intricate prosthetics I've ever seen. Almost had the exact same functionality as the leg that it replaced. And my friend sent me this picture and he said, you know, some people look at what God has done, look at things like this and say, praise God. I look at things like this and I say, praise science. And so I sent him a message in response. I said, you know, that is, you know, an impressive scientific achievement. That is an impressive prosthetic leg. I'm sure this man is extremely pleased to have this leg. But do you suppose we'll ever reach a point in our scientific discoveries, in our scientific inventiveness, do you think we'll ever reach a point where we will design a leg that is so lifelike, where we'll design a leg that is so close to the leg that it replaces, that a skeptic will come along and say, oh, well, that's a happy accident. Well, that's an interesting accidental occurrence. Well, of course not. We would never get to that point. Why? Because common sense keeps us from getting to that point. We look at a prosthetic leg and we intuitively recognize that it was designed. So why in the world would we look at the physical leg that the prosthetic replaces and conclude the opposite, that it wasn't designed, that it's just sort of a happy accident of the universe? It doesn't make any sense. Now, a related argument to the argument of design, I'm not going to write it up on the board, but a related argument is called the argument from information. The argument from information. And this argument exists in just 3 points as well. The first point is this: genetic material contains information. Genetic material contains information. What we've discovered about DNA specifically, about genetics in the last 50, 60 years is astounding. It's amazing. And it's gone a long way to bolstering our confidence that we are indeed carefully and wonderfully made. And so when you look at genetic material, DNA, it's impossible to not conclude that there is information in DNA. Here's the second point. The second point is that information is a byproduct of intelligence. Information is a byproduct of intelligence. Just look at the words that I've written up on the board. These words all contain information. Information points back to an intelligent cause. Some sort of intelligence had to be at work in order to communicate information. Okay? So the first point, genetic material contains information. It's the information that basically builds every cell in our body. Second point, information is the product of intelligence, that leads thirdly to the conclusion genetic material is a product of intelligence. When you look at the complexities of human DNA, I believe it's impossible not to see that as a product of intelligence. There's one last argument that I want to give you before I wrap this session up. We gave you an argument, a cosmological argument. We gave you an argument from design. The third argument is called a moral argument for God's existence, a moral argument for God's existence. And it also exists in three parts. The first part says this, that if God doesn't exist, then objective morals and duties, they also don't exist. Okay? If God doesn't exist, there is no objective morality. The second point says that objective morality does exist. So what's objective morality? What are we referring to? Objective morality is just the idea that there are things that are right, there are things that are wrong, objectively speaking. There are some things that are always right, there are some things that are always wrong, regardless of your opinion, regardless of the culture that you grew up in. Their objective morality exists. Objective morality exists. This leads then to the conclusion, okay, again, number one, if God doesn't exist, objective morals don't exist. Number two, objective morals exist. So number three, therefore, God exists. Now, skeptics will obviously try to challenge both of those premises. Some will challenge the notion that you need God in order to have objective morals and values, to which I would respond, there's really no other explanation for the existence of an objective moral system than the existence of a God who transcends this world. Skeptics tend to argue that objective morality is based on things like herd instinct, or they've simply evolved over time. Now think about that though. If that's the case, if morals have simply evolved over time, okay, that we've evolved over time to say it's wrong to kill other people, that's just a product of evolution. There's nothing binding about that morality though. That morality is simply descriptive. There's nothing binding about it. So all you can say is, evolution has told us that murder is wrong. But for me personally, if I want to murder, then it's not wrong for me. You see how objective morality kind of goes out the window? That whatever I want to do is really no one's business except for myself. If I can get away with it, then I can do it. And so some would argue that, well, objective morality doesn't exist. That what's wrong for one culture or one group of people isn't necessarily wrong for other groups of people. And to that, I would say, if that's the case, if there is no such thing as objective morality, then we are utterly lost, because it becomes impossible then for one group to judge the actions of another group. Now think about this. What it also does is it takes the moral reformer, the person who wants to change his culture for the better, and it renders that person not a reformer, but a villain. Because only a villain would want to change the morality of a culture. And you also have to ask the question, if you want to reform a culture, if you want to change a culture, and there is no sense of objective morality, then what guides us in our reform? Where are we going in our reform? What's the goal? So when you abandon objective morality, things start to fall apart rather quickly. And so I think this argument is a much better argument than some people might recognize. God, if objective morality exists, then that points to the existence of God. Because objective morality exists, God exists. And so these are just a handful of the arguments that can be made for a skeptic, showing, again, not proving that God exists, but at least showing that it's reasonable to believe that God does exist.